When reading charts for jazz standards, pop, rock, musical theatre, anywhere that you're playing chords, you may have come across slash chords like this. Now the way they work is much simpler than the way they look, and they actually make reading and writing difficult chords much simpler. We can use them in a much more developed way in a thing called polychords, which we'll get onto later in the video. So first, let's take a look at slash chords. So what exactly are slash chords? Well, imagine that you're playing a triad, so in this case, C major. And you decide to play it over a different bass note, so one that isn't necessarily in the triad, let's say B flat. That is, in itself, a slash chord. This is the most simple version of a slash chord, and that's all there is to it, really. Slash chords are notated as chord slash bass. So in the case of C over B flat, that reads as C slash B flat, C over B flat. It's like having a C major triad over a B flat bass note. And that can create some really interesting ways that we can simplify chord notation in sheet music. First, it's a shortcut to complex chord notation. Instead of scribbling B flat major 13 sharp 11 on your sheet, you can just write C over B flat. This makes things much easier to read on the page and helps you highlight those really important altered extensions here, like the sharp 11. Slash chords often give you a brilliant voicing for an otherwise complicated chord straight away. A voicing that you wouldn't necessarily have gone with yourself. It might not be triadic based, it might have some interesting intervals in it that you wouldn't have necessarily chosen first off. This is because slash chord voicings often miss out key chord tones, thirds, fifths, sevenths, because they favour those altered extensions, the 11ths, the 13s, the 9s. And that can make it ambiguous as to what quality of chord this is. So is it a major? Is it a minor? Is it a dominant seventh? Without the third, fifth and the seventh, it could be tricky to tell. This is where chord tension comes into play. There are a few tensions and altered extensions that simply aren't part of certain chord qualities. As with our chord from the beginning, the C over B flat. In this new B flat based chord, it contains a B flat, a C, an E and a G. In the context of a B flat chord, we're missing a fifth, a third and a seventh here. So how do we know that the chord is B flat major 13 sharp 11, as we said before? You've got to consider each chord's available tension. For example, a minor chord can't really pull off a sharp 11. So if you spot a slash chord with a sharp 11, it's a hint. It's probably major or dominant. A chord like C over B flat, no third or seventh, so it could be B flat major 13 sharp 11 or B flat 13 sharp 11. Never B flat minor 13 sharp 11. It's worth mentioning that we're not just limited to major triads on the top of these chords. We can play around with minor, augmented, diminished to create some more interesting and some more complex slash chord voicings. D minor over G, that's a pretty good go-to voicing for a G9. And if we build out that top D minor triad to a 4-note chord, a D minor 7, G9 sus4, a very easy, quick go-to voicing for a chord that may be complex in other ways. There are so many combinations here of different types of chords and bass notes, and they can be a great shorthand for writing chords for your own arrangements in notation, as well as a shortcut for playing them in performance. Now onto polychords, and polychords are often mixed up and confused with slash chords. Polychords blend two or more full chords to create one gigantic complex chord, in a sense. They look very much like slash chords. So, for instance, a D major over C major 7 polychord would look and sound like this. This notation might seem very similar to slash chords, and it is, but it's very important to not mix the two. Slash chords are talking about a chord over a single bass note. Polychords, a chord over a chord, or a chord over many chords. Now we can think of polychords in a couple of different ways. We can think of them as forming one unit, so one big complex chord, or we can think of them as two separate chords being played together to give a kind of polytonality, a bitonality to the sound. First, let's treat polychords as a single unit, a full, thick, colourful chord blending two chords together. Think of it as a chord in its own right. So imagine this, you're sight reading a piece. Instead of tackling a colossal chord, such as C13 flat 9 sharp 11, you're working with two smaller, friendlier chords. It's like saying I'll play an A6 in my right hand and a C7 in my left hand, rather than it's a C13 flat 9 sharp 11 chord. It's almost like the benefits we get from slash chords, but to a much more complex level. Now the alternative is that these two chords are being played separately, but forming something together. This is a more useful approach when thinking of soloing. If you're trying to choose a scale to solo over the chord, you can think of a scale that works over the chord as one unit, or you can think of two scales that work for each chord and play between those two, alternating between two tonalities at the same time. Here, when improvising over a polychord, you're essentially navigating two different chords at the same time. You play scales or arpeggios that suit each individual chord. It's like using two different colour palettes to form one new set of colours that may clash, but that's part of the fun of using this kind of dissonance. Now, polychords are much trickier to spot in notation than slash chords. Often they look the same as slash chords, and often they aren't even notated. They're used in more modern, modal jazz and post-bop. In a sense, they're not written down. They're just played. They're a vocabulary and a language that is being used in that performance. Polychords aren't just limited to two chords stacked on top of each other. We could have three, we could have four. So say a D over C diminished over B flat, for example. We're just getting more heavily altered extensions in that D chord, but we're writing it in a way that is instantly playable, instantly understandable as to what's in that chord. So that's slash chords versus polychords. As you can see, there are a lot of similarities. Polychords give you more option in colour in your voicings, and slash chords are much more common in notation for simpler chord revoicings. I hope that's cleared that concept up and you found out a bit more about how they're useful in writing and in performing. Thanks for watching.